It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from sister station Radio France International, Angela Diffley. How are you?
Good.
Good. Just good.
Very good.
Very good. Okay. Adam Flowerite, France correspondent for the French news agency AFP. How are you, sir?
Good evening, Francois.
All right. Hello to Stéphane de Vries, Paris correspondent for RTL4 and for Euronews. How are you?
I'm very fine, thank you.
All right. And France 24 senior correspondent Catherine Norris-Trent.
Hi there, Francois.
We're going to be able to update you because you're just off the plane. We'll talk about
I've
it
been
later.
frantically checking the news. So.
Just back from reporting assignment in Venezuela. We'll talk about Venezuela later. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. One of New Zealand's darkest days. The words of Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern after the country's worst ever a terror attack and one of the world's worst ever far-right terror attacks. This one targeting 2 Christchurch mosques, at least 49 killed, men, women, and children. New Zealand, where only 1% of the population is Muslim.
Many of those who will have been directly affected by this shooting may be migrants to New Zealand. They may even be refugees here. They have chosen to make New Zealand their home, and it is their home. They are us. The person who has perpetuated this violence against us is not. They have no place in New Zealand. There is no place in New Zealand for such acts of extreme and unprecedented violence.
Now, Angela, like everybody else around this table, because of the time difference, we all woke up to the alerts that this was happening. I mean, literally at the other end of the planet, and yet, from what we just heard from the New Zealand's Prime Minister, you really have a sense that it's a smaller world than it used to be when it comes to this type of incident.
Yeah, I woke up and heard another of her speeches. She's been talking all day or night as it is there. And such a shock of all the places. New Zealand is such a small country. It really is only heard on the world stage on issues like climate change, which affects obviously a small country in that part of the world. 5 million people. I remember when Jacinda Ardern gave her debut speech at the UN General Assembly, and she talked about climate change, she talked about polarisation in the world, and she finished off by saying that among the most important values for New Zealand was straightforward, old-fashioned kindness. And this is the last place in the world where you would expect something like this. It does show us that far-right ideologies are on the rise. We've seen how quickly this has spread on social media, even though the social media companies quickly tried to get the footage off the air. It's been shared. It's very worrying, and a number of countries have said that their intelligence services are now trying to get on top of a rising far-right
Stéphane de Vries, it's been hours since the attack, and all of the major social network platforms, Facebook, YouTube, which is owned by Google, Twitter, they've been scrambling with more or less success to remove people who've been rebroadcasting the 17 minutes from the shooter's body cam. Is it time, for instance, to ban Facebook Live?
I wouldn't say so. I think, of course, with these kinds of horrible events, we tend to take measures that are, well, that don't really make sense, because it also has an advantage, of course, that there's now that anyone can broadcast anything in the world. I'm an advocate of absolute free speech, but it does raise concern, of course, that these kinds of events. Well, events is
because
so
you heard Angela. New Zealand is a tolerant place.
Absolutely,
all it takes is a tiny group of very determined people who have this giant echo chamber.
Absolutely, but do we have to surrender to these kinds of people? The freedom of speech is absolutely crucial to any democracy, and unfortunately, we have these kinds of excesses. But we've seen also in the past, especially here in France, following the terrorist attacks, that there is a huge limitation of freedom of speech in the last couple of years. France is one of the countries in the world with the most strict rules of freedom of press, freedom of expression. And these are all horrible consequences of societies that transform into very fearful societies. And of course, New Zealand may be the last place where we can expect such horrible attacks. But as you said, unfortunately, these theories, these tendencies of white supremacists to not only to be violent in words, but also in actions, is a very horrible development. And indeed, as you said, many intelligence services, especially in Europe, are now afraid that the biggest threats come from extremist right-wing groups and not from Muslim extremists, as we have been used to the last couple of years.
All right, so 2 points there. First of all, Stefan, defending the idea of, look, free speech, keep the social media platforms, there's only so much you can do. And then, of course, the idea of maybe we've been paying too much attention to Islamist radicals and not enough to the far right.
I think on the free speech argument, there are multiple countries now that have been tightening up their legislation to try and put controls on the social media platforms to make sure they're more responsive in these sort of incidents, to take stuff down and generally sort of halt the spread of extremist content online. And personally, I think that's a good thing. I think the argument from Facebook and Twitter that they've made for years that forcing them to do that, they're very reluctant to it. They've generally sort of underinvested in that. They've not seen it as a priority. And of course, these are companies with, in the case of Facebook, with billions of dollars of revenue.
The body cam that the guy uses is this device you use in video games. So he's broadcasting this thing like it's a video game.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of every time you have one of these incidents, it's talked about afterwards. How do you control that content? Now, Facebook and Google and Twitter come back and they'll say they've got teams that are taking stuff down as quickly as they can. The problem they have, of course, is there are people out there probably more numerous than the number of people they employ doing that work, who are then copying, ripping the video and reposting it again. So it is there's no doubt there are great challenges in controlling that content. But I think there is still this ongoing debate about whether those companies dedicate sufficient resources to fighting that problem.
Do you agree with Stefan? Don't ban Facebook Live?
I don't think we should ban Facebook Live. I think it'd be wrong to sort of blame the technology for an act of sort of human folly. I think that's probably the wrong response. I think the response is trying to control that what's done with that content afterwards.
Catherine Norstrand?
Well, one interesting other angle we could perhaps look at is, the fault for these terrible events were clearly with the attacker or attackers. There should be perhaps a debate about Islamophobia and the tone with which some incidents or communities are talked about in the media. Not all media, of course, but obviously with the rise of populism we've seen in recent years, there's been a lot of anti-immigration publications or political parties and platforms given to those. And obviously with the internet making the world a much smaller space, those ideas have been allowed to grow and spread as well. So
how much is there the enabling? He wrote this long manifesto. He hailed in it Donald Trump, a Trump advocate. He spoke of Marine Le Pen. Now, Marine Le Pen does not advocate shooting Muslims, but there's the question, to what degree do populist and far-right figures enable?
Well, I think there's a degree to which they blame the other. They blame ethnic minorities in the West. There's unwanted focus put on Muslim communities, and some of this slides over into Islamophobia. Now, clearly they don't advocate murder, but things like, the ban that Donald Trump had on people coming into the States from Muslim countries, that's just heightens this kind of atmosphere. And so that's something I think we all need to be very careful about. A serious debate needs to be held up in various countries about how the media covers some of these debates. Some columnists and a lot of people looking for clicks online with ever more controversial articles. I mean, it's all interconnected. While obviously the fault only lies with the killers, we've got to look at some of the roots of some of the attitudes here as well, I think.
France 24 taking the decision not to show any of the video, not even stills. Other news media showing stills of from this body cam.
Yeah, I think if I would be an editor-in-chief, I wouldn't show these images either, because it doesn't add anything to what has happened. It hasn't any news value, if you like, because that's the only thing you have to judge. Of course, you have to try to be objective. But then it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that shows that it's not only Facebook Live. Even the mainstream media or normal, I hate that term, but let's say television stations, the big, the old-fashioned media, even they decide to broadcast these images because they know they get viewers, and that's probably the real issue. I think France 24 and also many other television stations made a very wise decision. I think we also have a responsibility as journalists. I find it, I can remember the images of 2015 when we saw the footage of the police officer here in Paris who was executed almost live. And I was actually in the very close by. And I still can't watch those images. And I'm used to horrible images. And I still think that a lot of TV stations who decided at that time to broadcast it made a terrible mistake. But that is, of course, the choice of us journalists. But it doesn't mean that we can prevent that these images are being, distributed, because even if there wouldn't be a Facebook Live, even if we would have just recorded these images and somehow found a way to get these images to his, supporters, whomever, they will get distributed worldwide. So it is a very complex problem, of course, but I don't think we should surrender to the freedom of speech, but we have, of course, a responsibility.
And we had this debate in the AFP today about how much of this manifesto, which you mentioned, this 74-page document that he posted online beforehand, and sort of what is the news value of that, and which bits do you reproduce and judge to be sort of relevant to the story. And I think it's obvious, as you say, there's a fine line between explaining who this individual is, what he was motivated by, without propagating his racist, Islamophobic views, and it's a document that's designed to sort of incite other people to carry out copycat attacks, and there's a very clear link between attacks that then inspire other people afterwards. In the case of Breivik, the Norwegian killer from 2011, who's been linked who's mentioned in the document, and is then it's been shown that he's an inspiration for other people afterwards, sadly. And again, with this document, it's very much written with that in mind.
Yeah, and the public does want to know, Angela Diffley. Of course, there's one aspect of this, which is that New Zealand law is a bit like British law. So, for instance, there are two other people who are being questioned by police. We don't really know why at this point, because they're really tight-lipped. We don't even have confirmation that it's the same shooter at both mosques at this point, and they do keep it under wraps in the same way that the British do once a criminal investigation has begun.
Well, it's always better to be clear of the facts before they are multiplied by a million, and I have to say I think that's the correct thing to do, and that is the way things are done in New Zealand. It's as simple as that. They're going by the rules. They're not used to this sort of event, thankfully, and hopefully they won't have to get used to it.
All right. Withdrawing the name of Algeria's ailing president from the ballot, postponing elections, promising a new constitution. None of that enough to stop huge crowds from returning to the streets for a fourth consecutive Friday. These are pictures from Algiers, but the same scenes in Constantine, in Oran, in Tizi Ouzou, the biggest demonstrations in decades, perhaps since independence from France in 1962, with protesters unimpressed by the sacking of the prime minister. They're now calling for more than just the departure of the incapacitated Abdelaziz Bouteflika. They want an end to the same regime that's held the reins of power since independence.
This fourth protest is to say no to all the changes that have been made recently. It's to say to this government and to this system that it's over for them. That's it.
The system, le système, is what the Algerians call it. This nebulous, very secretive, clannish decision-making process where you can have a president who suffered a stroke in 2013 and whose name is still put up on the ballot in 2019.
Yeah, that's right. I covered the last Algerian elections in 2014, and even back then, we just ran into young people all the times on the streets who were saying this can't continue, we've had enough, it's just ridiculous, that they felt the country was a laughingstock. A lot of the things that have been coming out in this protest has been brewing for an awfully long time. And yeah, a real sense that even if he went, well, another veteran of the independence war or one of their allies would take over, and the whole system is completely opaque. And people are very mistrusting of the whole government system. And so I'm not surprised that they're still out protesting even after the promises made by Bouteflika, because a lot of them say this is another ruse. This is his latest ruse to stay in power, actually after the end of his fourth mandate, which was going to be ended by the upcoming elections. And actually without elections for, another period of time. And so they're saying, hang on, this is perhaps a con in there somewhere. They don't believe necessarily that the constitutional reforms will bring anything meaningful. And so they think, hang on, this is just, a very cunning way of getting around the problem.
I think it's extraordinary that that the pouvoir hadn't prepared for this. Everyone knew that Bouteflika was going to die, and it seems that there was such rivalry between the various people within his entourage that they haven't been able maybe to choose a preferred successor and elegantly get him into place. Now you have this massive grassroots movement, which is not led by any opposition leaders either. They too are very fragmented, with very different ideas, and so what could happen, as everyone fears, is that stepping into the vacuum will be a la Arab Spring, Islamists and all the problems and any other difficult group.
Yeah, Algerian protesters seem to be very wary. They remember, of course, the blood years. They remember as well the disappointments of the Arab Spring in other countries. And so, for instance, we saw this Friday demonstrators, organizers saying at 5 p.m. go home quietly to make sure there was no violence.
Yeah, it's incredibly polite, actually, all these demonstrations. I mean, if it's not a right comparison, but if you compare to the yellow vests, I think we have a lot to learn from the way the Algerians are protesting. And it's already going on for 3 or 4 weeks. So with relatively few injured people. And it's interesting also that the Arab Spring, which started in 2011, correct me if I'm wrong, never really occurred in Algeria. It more or less, it didn't take place in Algeria because it's a completely a society that was completely, I don't know how you would say it, but
traumatized.
Yeah, traumatized. Yes.
So
it was somehow the odd one out. The other odd one out was, of course, Tunisia, where it seems like it's going well there, relatively, of course. But in Algeria, it stayed calm. So now, 8 years later, finally, the youth takes to the streets, and I think almost half of the population is under 30, and it's quite admirable, even though they haven't achieved anything substantial yet. It's still looking very promising.
One of those lessons, Adam Plowright, for that youthful uprising we're seeing is at some point, if they really want change, well, they're going to have to designate leaders.
Certainly, that's true. And at the moment, it's this standoff where we're seeing the same thing week after week, and we're in a time of a crisis really for the country. But it's a non-violent crisis at this point, which is obviously everyone looking on is grateful for that. But at some point, one does wonder sort of where's it heading? And we've seen Bouteflika obviously decide not to run for his fifth term, but there's still that question of sort of the uncertainty of what happens now, and people in the street saying, he's still in power. How long does this transition period go on for? But if they are the opposition, the historic political opposition in Algeria is clearly not in a position to be able to capitalise from these demonstrations. It's very much led from the street. So who does take part in that national dialogue which has been promised?
Something we'll have to see. Pressure from the youth in Algeria, pressure from around the world from the youth when it comes to the environment. We'll talk about it when we come back. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. We're joined by Angela Diffley, journalist at sister station Radio France International. Welcome back as well to Adam Plowright of the French news agency Agence France Presse, AFP. Stéphane de Vries, Paris correspondent for RTL4 and Euronews, and France 24 senior correspondent Catherine Norris-Trent. Catherine, just back from Venezuela, in the midst of that standoff between the embattled president Nicolas Maduro, his rival leader Juan Guaido. The country's worst power outages happened while you were on assignment over there, crippling the nation, with both sides, blaming the other.
Well, This was sabotage, which cut off electricity in the whole country. We are in the streets to show that we won't give in. Even if they cut off the lights and the water, even if it's hard to find food, we will stay in charge of our own country.
Whose fault is it? The government's, of course. Who in the government? I don't know exactly who, but the government in general. They haven't done enough or made enough effort to take care of the country.
So pardon the pun, people in the dark over what's going on.
Well, it's just so polarized, really, and it's difficult, obviously, to know the proportions. There are still people who support, well, on the surface at least, the government of Nicolas Maduro, and they say that this whole power shortage was an American-led plot to attack the infrastructure to put more pressure on Maduro. I mean, a lot of other people we spoke to on the ground say, look, this is years of mismanagement, of corruption, of lack of maintenance of the infrastructure, that, Venezuela's had blackouts for many years now, and, people are used to not having power for several hours a day. What was different this time? It was the longest continuous countrywide blackout that Venezuela had seen.
Yeah, the metro ground to a halt.
Right. It really affected everything, and even just down to getting food, because there's basically no cash in Venezuela because the hyperinflation, the bolivar. You'd need a huge bag of them to go and buy some potatoes. So people have kind of abandoned cash. In some places you can pay in dollars, but many places it's electronic card transactions, even in the slums. And so when you go and buy food and the card machine isn't working because no electricity, people were getting really desperate, and there were huge queues, almost kind of riots outside food shops because people can't get enough food, water. A lot of it's based on electric pumps in these huge buildings, these sky rises in Caracas. So people were running out of drinking water. Old people stuck in apartments because they couldn't get down with the lifts. A lot of very isolated people were in danger in hospitals. We had constant reports about people dying because dialysis machines weren't working, defibrillators. And, we went to try and investigate in some of these hospitals, which are tightly guarded by Chavista militias, and it smelt of death in some of the hospitals. So you can really imagine the bad state things are in, and people were getting pretty desperate. There were reports of even some looting starting in several areas. So I think this kind of shows just how on a knife edge the country is, that if the power goes out and nothing's kind of working, then very quickly descends into chaos, really.
This kind of death dance that we're seeing between Maduro and the opposition, I mean, how long can it go on?
Well, that's the question. People keep saying, this has got to come to a head now, but I think it could probably go on for quite some time, because obviously Maduro let Guaido come back into the country from his Latin American tour without arresting him. There were lots of questions about whether he would do so. Now, Venezuelan authorities under Maduro have placed Guaido under investigation again, accusing him of sabotage. He's already been under investigation. It's a way of putting pressure on him. If he arrests Guaido, then he's going to come under a huge amount of pressure. So perhaps the best thing he can do is to let this situation stagnate even more. And still got the army there. You're seeing the defense minister. He's still got the army on side. Russia and China are on side as well, some powerful international allies. So it could go on for quite a long time, really.
Just one final point on this. We talked about social media earlier. Views entrenched around the world when they watch this. It's like we're back to the Cold War. One reaction on the hashtag world this week: I wonder how much humanitarian aid would be required in Venezuela if we didn't turn off their power, do embargoes or sanctions, freeze financial assets. Actually, I know, but I wonder at the credulity of typical U.S. news consumers. It's obviously a U.S. Viewer. With the hashtag hands off Venezuela. People, when you come back, when you leave Venezuela, they talk about it in sort of Cold War terms.
Right, exactly. And everyone's kind of decided for themselves which side they're on. It's very difficult, isn't it? Because there's a lot of conspiracy theories flying out around there. You can go there and work as a journalist, but you've got to be quite careful of what you do as well. People do speak openly. You can go and see things for yourselves, and you can see just how difficult it is. And, you do see even just the water pipes and the systems. It does look pretty dilapidated. So this argument that it just hasn't been maintained, there's been a lot of corruption, you can get a sense of that as well. Has there been outside influence? Well, that's what Nicolas Maduro would say. And that kind of thing's really impossible to prove, isn't it? So that just fuels these conspiracy theories time and time again. But yeah, I think it's just going to get more polarized from here, really.
Here in Europe, and not just Europe, around the world, but especially here in Europe, there are populist calls to hark back to the nation state to solve Europe's problems. And then there are those who want their leaders to think globally. What started during the summer as one Swedish schoolgirl's lone protest against global warming has, well, snowballed. The Fridays for the Future rallies here in Paris have grown each week. The biggest one yet this Friday in the French capital. And Stéphane de Vries, your thoughts on, well, some of us older folks were looking at it a bit paternalistically, if you'll excuse me, saying, oh, yes, well, they don't have enough of a political conscience. And
I think the contrary, actually. I'm also not very young anymore, unfortunately. But no, it gives hope. And I think most of them have a point by saying, you parents or you politicians, you haven't done anything. It's your mess that we will have to clean up. So I think it's quite great to see these people marching and all around the world, and it changes the dynamics in European politics, because if we look at the polls now, I mean, we have European elections in about 2 months from now. The European Greens in many countries are doing very, very well, especially in the west and the north of Europe, not really in the south, but it has an effect already on politics, and you see that politicians like Emmanuel Macron or also the Dutch Prime Minister, they change their discourse, and they talk now really about doing something about the climate. Of course, there is still talk, because in reality nobody does anything, and we're absolutely on a collision course to total apocalypse. But that's an all different debate. But I think it's great that these, at least, I think we're doomed. So if you're watching this, I'm sorry, but no, it's great, actually. It's really great.
You mentioned France. This week, the French president shored up his green credentials by co-hosting a One Planet summit in Nairobi in the company of his Kenyan counterpart, Uhuru Kenyatta. Emmanuel Macron on a tour of East Africa, while back home on Thursday, environmental groups were suing the French state for not going green fast enough. The groups that launched these lawsuits include the environmental group Angela Diffley, that's run by his former environment minister, who you'll remember slammed the door. Yes, slammed the door a few months ago. People say, the French aren't that into environmental issues. Are you surprised to see? I mean, they were, according to organizers, 40,000 kids in the streets of Paris today. Are you surprised?
No, because kids all think the same the world over in many ways. I feel they all look at Facebook, they're swept in this direction or that. I applaud it. It's good. Greta is highly committed, but it does bring out the cynic in me a little bit. Problems are easy, solutions are difficult. And, when they're paying taxes and when they're older and you're having, the fact is politics is messy, it's impure, it's unglamorous, it's full of skullduggery. But when you have to marry the interests of urban people, rural people, butchers, vegans, it's not that straightforward. And it's good. They're young, they're idealistic. Great.
Do you agree with that reasoning, Adam?
I think I may be a little bit more, touched by the sight of young, idealistic people being out there, and I find the movement itself sends a really powerful message. I think the idea of sort of going on strike and skipping school, and going out to protest about this is a great thing.
And how old are your kids?
They're young. They're not. No, they weren't out there today.
No, but just a question on this, because Greta Thunberg, she's been asked, okay, so what solutions? She says, I don't know, I'm a kid. It's for the grown-ups. But she's very angry about it when you ask her, because she says, well,
I think she's probably the wrong person to solve this.
Yeah,
to ask to solve this problem. But I think what it does is it puts pressure on politicians, and I think anything that encourages us to think a bit more deeply and change our ways more quickly to confront a problem which is an existential one is got to be a good thing. I think.
Certainly, as individuals, I suppose it makes us behave better.
She does have some of the answers, though, because she says people should stop taking planes, and she calls us to stay on the ground. And world air travel, the expansion of airports, obviously is a huge factor to the warming of the planet. So I think we shouldn't discount them. There obviously is a bit of naivety, and it is easy to be cynical, because I think in order to change the way the environment's going, I think we're heading for apocalypse too. I mean, it would be about changing our entire model of consumption.
Well, she says
and you see all the teenagers
in
there
her family.
their,
She
their,
said they don't eat meat. She says they don't buy each other Christmas presents anymore because it's wasteful consumption.
Right, you can do a buy nothing new Christmas. There are practical ideas out there, and I think we should listen to the ideas of young people. They really do, but it's about changing the bigger model. And yeah, we've definitely got to get young people on board with that because they're big consumers of.
It highlights as well is this idea of sort of like tension between the generations, I think, which is something that we're probably going to see more of because the kids, as Stefan mentioned before, are going to be the people who live with the consequences of this. And I remember last summer a conversation I was listening to my nephew talking to my grandmother, and they were talking about climate change and stuff, and he turned around and sort of went, look, Gran, you burn the planet pretty much, and that was his kind of line, and it was sort of quite powerful. You're like, look, this is how they, how they view it, and I think that's why the sight of them in the streets really underlines that message.
But it's a sign of the times. Anger again. I mean, I know I'm on the wrong side of that generational war, but it's that anger. It's not the love, peace, hippie thing. Everyone is so angry about everything.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of being angry about everything, just when you thought there might be some kind of Brexit breakthrough this past week, the UK Parliament in the end agreeing on little more than to buy itself more time. More on that in a moment. And by a 2-vote margin, refusing to take control of the process from the Prime Minister. Yes, this is the front cover of The Economist, a Prime Minister who earlier in the week had lost more than just her voice when she warned the House of Commons to back her divorce deal or else.
The danger for those of us who want to deliver, to have faith with the British public and deliver on their vote for Brexit, is that if this vote is not passed tonight, if this deal is not passed, then Brexit could be lost.
If this vote is not passed, so you weren't back yet, so I'll just brief you here.
I was trying to follow on Twitter when I had electricity.
She lost by 149 votes this time.
Right, which is one of the 3 biggest losses in modern British parliamentary history. The biggest loss being the first time she put this deal to Parliament on the 15th of January. I mean, it's not going well, is it? But who thought it would go well this week? I mean, nothing's resolved. We're probably going to get a delay. That could still not happen if the EU, for some reason, decide not to agree to a delay in time. I mean, who knows what's going to happen next? Well, there are signs that the DUP, this is important to look over this weekend, the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, this very pro-Brexit party, very conservative ally of Theresa May's Conservative Party, who've proved the kingmakers with their 10 votes in Parliament. There are signs that they could perhaps be coming round to vote for her deal when it's put back a third time, if it's put back a third time before Parliament, or perhaps they're just trying to get more money from Theresa May, because that's coming up for renewal soon, and they got a £1 billion payment last time for their support 2 years ago. That's up for renegotiation. So,
all right, early next week, Theresa May will be putting her divorce deal to the Commons. As Catherine was saying, for a third time, Daily Telegraph cartoonist Matt has got his opinion on how that's going to go. Wait, I want to ask you for a third time, says the man as the woman runs away. Angela Diffley, are we underestimating Theresa May because she's playing the clock? There's next week going to be an EU summit that's on the 21st, next Thursday. Is this her whole plan has been all along to run the clock down and say it's my deal or chaos?
Well, she has clearly at each stage presented them with the options and said, you realise by not voting that the default option is a no deal until that was ruled out. And I don't know how much of it was planned and clever.
Because there was this Benn amendment yesterday in the Commons, which lost by 2 votes, which would have handed some of the power back to Parliament, and it got voted down.
But there are still, if next week her vote is, it could go either way next week. Either it could be voted in on this third vote, as Catherine says, because people have looked over the precipice. The Brexiteers who didn't like that deal have realised that they could have Brexit delayed for as much as a year and possibly lose it altogether, and they might back down and vote for it. If they don't, she's agreed to facilitate votes on other possibilities, a customs union, single markets. It's back to square one at that stage. all of this is, I don't know how clever she was. I don't know how much of it is accident. I don't think she's utterly inept. I think it was an impossible job. I think she made a huge error in not consulting earlier on. And had she...
Consulting the other parties at the outset.
And had she done that, it might have become screamingly obvious that her red lines were incompatible, that you cannot not be in the single market or the customs union and not have a border with Northern Ireland unless you put a border down the Irish Sea. All of those three things she tried to get, they are simply not compatible. And that perhaps would have become obvious more quickly had she looked across party consensus.
So we have no idea what's going to happen next week. And more broadly, how do you fill what looks like a power vacuum right now in London?
A power vacuum, yeah. I mean, it's difficult to know who's in, well, Theresa May is still Prime Minister, which, we wondered whether she would still be there at this point, and having, two of the heaviest defeats in British history. Many Prime Ministers before her would have been gone after the first one. She's still nominally in control of the process, but obviously with Parliament casting decisive votes on what she puts in front of them, and mostly defeating her. But what happens next? I think that, obviously they will go for a delay. I think what's fascinating is how the EU now responds to this. And you get a lot of sense with Brexit, particularly in the UK, it's constantly sort of Britain negotiating with itself and sort of forgetting that there's actually a partner on the other side of the table that is looking after its own interests. What does the EU respond to Theresa May? We've got a European Council meeting of leaders coming up. It's going to be decisive.
We heard the president of the European Council, Donald Tusk, saying, longer extension could be in the cards. And some inside of the Commission are talking about 2 years, just like Theresa May.
That's, it's like somebody's dying and you still want to keep on the ventilator. It's a dead body and we should bury it. And it's the Europeans are over it. And it's a British problem now because the Brits don't seem to be able to make up their minds. And Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator of the European Commission, this week said that, well, when he asked if he was in favor of an extension, he said, well, what for? And that's exactly the question, because it doesn't seem like, they voted this week against a no deal, then they voted against a no deal. So what do they want, And the extension doesn't really solve any problems. And also, legally, it's very complicated because in 2.5 months from now we have the European elections. Theoretically, the Brits will no longer be part of the European Parliament. Then suddenly they will have to organise European elections. The distribution of the seats in the European Parliament is already been decided. So it will be a complete mess if the extension will last longer than, let's say, 5-6 weeks. And even then, I think the result will exactly be the same.
There's also, they can't let it go on too long. If ever there is a long extension, it can't be so long that it goes into the next budget after, it gets more and more complicated, the next European budget.
One final point on this. I noticed the pound. It's gone up the last couple of days. Do markets think that, well, maybe this whole Brexit thing isn't going to happen?
Because they're betting on that. I must confess, I'm not a currency market specialist, so I'm not the best placed person to reply. I think you'd be a fool really to place any money on the outcome of these negotiations at this point. I really think I think everything is very much on the table. No Brexit is possible. So is a soft Brexit. So is a no deal Brexit, which you mentioned before. It is a British problem, but there's certainly a hardening of attitudes, and there's I think a desire really to sort of, for some people, to cut Britain loose, and they're just sort of fed up with this circus. But at the same time, it's a European problem. A no-deal Brexit
they're fed up,
has huge economic consequences for the rest of the European Union. And however much that desire to get rid of and just bring an end to what's been 2.5 years of negotiations, at the same time, European leaders know that by doing that, if they do cut Britain loose, they refuse an extension, they've got a big problem on their hands as well.
All right, they're fed up, and Stefan de Vries is certainly fed up by the sound of it. But yet, I'm still being asked, and I'll ask you, is it really going to happen? Is Brexit really going to happen? We're still asking the question.
Yeah, I know. It's unbelievable, isn't it? I think it is going to happen, but who knows? With Brexit, everything's unpredictable. I would put it around a 20% chance of there being a second referendum, not higher than that, because it's so politically divisive that a lot of people would be disenfranchised by it. There's mounting anger. There's be such a mess, really. It would be hard for any politician to push it through. Having said that, there is this People's Vote campaign, which is continuing to push. They kind of holding back their horses to them and saying it's not the time now. It's that they're going to wait till the very last minute to say, look, okay, it's not working. Let's go for a second referendum. It's still possible.
And then what would be in that referendum?
Right.
And
So
it's
that's
by
not
no
going
means certain that the result would be to stay in the European Union.
All right.
It's okay to keep voting in Parliament. That's fine, but not a second referendum. It's sort of,
That would be a travesty of democracy.
It certainly got all of us on our seat's edge. It took more than 72 hours for Boeing and U.S. regulators to finally ground the 737 MAX. This in the wake of last Sunday's Ethiopian Airlines crash that killed 157 from 35 different nationalities. The circumstances virtually identical to last October Lion Air crash in Indonesia. That was the vertical speed. What was going fast, these graphs? That was the vertical speed for the Ethiopian Airlines crash. And you could see roughly it's the same scenario. The pilots desperately trying to override the automated technology inside the craft, redress the nose just before it impacts. Boeing has now announced it's to roll out a software upgrade for its 737 MAX stall prevention system in 10 days' time, something the New York Times reports pilots had been urging since last October. What initial conclusions do you draw from this tragedy, Stefan de Vries?
Yeah, very difficult to draw any conclusions. But what does strike me, especially reading the New York Times article, is that there's actually a collusion between the Boeing and the FAA, that they're so tightly connected, and that Boeing is basically, apparently it's very well protected by the American government, understandably, because it's considered, of course, a strategic company. But yeah, it raises the question, even these planes are brand new or almost brand new. So even in brand new planes, we are not safe. Who's responsible? And, so I think it's hard to draw any conclusions, but I think I'm not sure whether it's overreacting to ground all these planes. But maybe it's careful. I don't know. I'm not an airline specialist, but it does raise a lot of questions, especially since air traffic is in there's a huge increase in air traffic. So safety should come first.
Safety should come first, and especially after last October's crash, we're seeing that these issues have not been fully addressed. And there was that tweet by Donald Trump this week saying he doesn't want Albert Einstein flying his plane. The worry about the technology
the planes are more and more autonomous and less pilots.
And so the pilot can't override when there's a problem.
Yeah, I suppose it's a problem. The pilots seemed very worried, and it seemed that the pushing to have the aircraft grounded was coming from the pilots. I think the Federal Aviation Authority doesn't have a leader at the moment, does it? Because there was some dispute over who would be the leader. Trump proposed his own pilot, and the people who should have okayed it said, don't be ridiculous, find someone else. And I don't think they found someone else. I don't know if that contributed to the delay, but the pilots seemed to be pushing for a grounding, and it took a long time to happen.
So regulation a lot more light touch than it used to be when it comes to the FAA in the United States. But Adam Plowright, people will be watching us from places like the United States, will be saying, oh, there's some geopolitics involved here because they're in Europe and Europe is Airbus. And so Airbus is going to put the knife in, which they haven't publicly at least, to Boeing.
Yeah, it's one of the great sort of commercial rivalries, on a global scale between Airbus, of course, which is based in, at least in part, down in southwest France in Toulouse, a Franco-German company, and Boeing, and they compete. And really, the important thing, and this is why we've seen Boeing's share price crash so significantly this week, is that the 737 is really it's the mass market commercial airliner made by Boeing, and Airbus's A320 is its great rival. And they've both brought out new models in the A320 Neo, which is the Airbus offering, and which came out slightly before the 737 MAX. But this is obviously a huge strategic importance for Boeing.
For both, and for Boeing in particular, restoring confidence and giving answers to the victims' families from those two crashes. I want to thank you, Adam Plowright. I want to thank as well Catherine Norris-Trent, Stefan de Vries, Angela Diffley. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.